both states have heightened up this whole sense of tech transfer, collaboration. They've both really put it in a new bottle, and that bottle is national security. And that's really part of what I'm writing as well, which is to say, hey guys, you want to close down what's real national security, but you don't want to close down cancer research. You don't want to close down all kinds of useful exchanges that are really important for humankind.
My name is Yangyang Cheng. I am a research scholar in law and fellow at Yale Law School's Paul China Center. On behalf of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, I'm really excited today to talk with Professor David Zweig about his new book, The War for Chinese Talent in America. And this is a book that is actually really dear to me because before my current career, I actually worked as a particle physicist for over a decade, and not that long ago. During the Obama era, even though it feels like a lifetime ago, I was one of the international students coming from China to the United States. And so if we should get started with the conversation, I would first ask a housekeeping question with regards to a central word in the title is the word talent. And talent, of course, can mean a lot of things, but I think this book, talent really means something very specific with regards to people with advanced degree educations, and especially in the fields like STEM, science, engineering. And so, David, if I may,
Yeah, go
contextualize the
ahead.
term for us, and
Go ahead.
why is talent defined this way, not just in your book, but in terms of why science and engineering being privileged in the policy discourse in both Washington and Beijing?
Thanks. I think, talent is really a measure of national power. Traditionally, before World War II, let's say, states got powerful through territorial conquest. After World War II, trade became a major way that states could get rich. And in fact, China's first 30 years, up until about 2010, it was all China's enhanced power, state power was largely driven by trade. But now China feels, and I think the United States feel, and the world in general feels that a key indicator of national power is how good is your research? How innovative is your country? How much new technology are you creating? And are you at the cutting edge? Are you in the leading edge of technology?
Yeah, absolutely. When I was like a young child growing up in central China in the 90s and 2000s, I suddenly also heard all these terminologies with regards to like Deng Xiaoping's famous proclamation that science and technology is the first productive force. And one of the things that I really appreciate about your book is the historical perspective you bring. Like overseas talent recruitment in China is not a new issue. On one hand, it can date all the way back to the 19th century to the Qing era. But in the contemporary context, it mostly dates to the post-Mao era, the reform era. And in the late 1970s to the 1980s, when Chinese students could go abroad to study for the first time in decades. And the Chinese government had a sense like it was a politically contested issue as well in terms of what the students are going to do. Are they going to come back or not? And the Chinese government is held like different factions, different agencies held different views. And then in the end, some views won. And so you really contextualize that part of the history. In particular, there was a famous meeting at the end of 1988 where there were 4 different perspectives being raised and then one perspective won. Would you please contextualize that a bit for us?
Sure. It was in response to the fact that around 1987, 1988, it was discovered that students weren't coming back. And that created, I think, a panic within the leadership, particularly within the Ministry of Education, which felt that it would look terrible that it was sending people out, but it couldn't bring them back. And it's a very conservative institution, so I think they felt a lot of pressure. So as far as I know, 4 groups got together. One was the State Science and Technology Commission, which said, "Oh, it's okay. Let them go overseas. Let them learn. Eventually that stuff will come back to China. It's okay." The Chaoban, the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office under the State Council, they said, "Oh, let them get citizenship. They'll settle, they get citizenship, and they can do what Xi Jinping actually says, which is, tell the China story well." And Zhao Ziyang was known to have said that this is really storing brain power overseas, and he won the fight. in the short term. Well, actually, one in the long term, but they didn't bring people back. I mean, that was the big, the Ministry of Education wanted to cancel exchange programs, sort of this gut response.
Absolutely. And so in your book, you also describe this concept as a way to mitigate the so-called brain drain. So I feel that I should say for the record that I dislike the term brain drain to no end. I feel that it is a very, very dehumanizing term. Like, I'm not a brain, I'm a person, I'm a body. But for
Right.
the sake of conversation, we'll keep this term.
Well,
And
I'm a
and
brain
then
drain too. I'm Canadian. I'm a Canadian and I live in New York. I got a PhD in the United States. So
yes,
just
and
like
you taught in Hong Kong for many years. And
yeah.
so
But like many
absolutely.
Chinese students, I have a Harvard PhD, so I came to America.
I guess we both kind of belong to this term that you describe in the book, the so-called brain circulation. And partly that is also the Chinese government in response to the situation you described, concerns over the vast majority of Chinese students who went abroad to study did not come back or would not come back full time. And so the Chinese government came up with this different ideas of how they could visit China or come back to work part-time, or they can still contribute to the development of science, technology, and education in China from abroad.
Sure.
In
It,
particular, there was a famous document from 2001. Would you like to describe a bit of that as well?
sure. The idea was you didn't have to 回国服务. You didn't have to come back to serve the nation, right? 服务, but you could 为国服务. You could help from abroad. And this, in that document, they listed using professional bodies, professional organizations like the Ethnic Chinese Business Council or scientists could use their organization to transfer technology, to come back and visit, coming and visiting, doing lectures, joint training of graduate students, investing in China, opening up a company was seen to be something that people wanted, running conferences, exchanges, all kinds of things like that. That was Jiang Zemin, his era, where he pushed that, where he wanted to try to get people to contribute. That really started back in 1996, but this document is really the first clear statement of the policy.
Absolutely. And so, as you mentioned, these types of policies date back decades, and with a clearly stated document dates back to 2001. And so, in a way, Chinese scientists and students going abroad to study and stay, and in some way also working part-time in China or participating in different types of academic collaboration and academic exchange programs are not new. And in a way, for many years, including the time when I was a student, an undergraduate student in China in the mid-2000s to a graduate student here in the U.S. in the 2010s, it was something that felt was encouraged, not just on the Chinese side, but also on the U.S. side, embraced by U.S. academia as well.
This is the
But
collaborate. You mean the collaborative
yes,
work?
the academic exchange and the collaborations and the law
Well, in
grants.
2010, I mean, the best example is
Mhm.
the whole question of oncology and the curing of cancer. And in 2010, you have Project Moonshot, where the Obama administration and the Natural Science Foundation of China signed an agreement to cure cancer. And it's renewed in 2015. And so, unfortunately, many of the targets of the attack, many of the Chinese who came under attack during the China initiative were actually involved in cancer research, which to me is ludicrous, not just because they were encouraged to do it, but also because the world needs them to do this work.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought up this point, and we'll talk about that in more detail later with regards to this focus on life sciences and medical research. But then to take a step back, as you mentioned, right, up until about a decade or so ago, this was still highly encouraged by not just academia in both countries, but also the governments. And so what has changed over the past 5 to 10 years that has led to this kind of tension?
Well, I think the change from my perspective starts with Li Yanchao leaving the job, leaving the post as the director of the organization department. Liberal guy, really interested by and large in making China innovative, but focuses very much on domestic reform within the Chinese Academy of Sciences, within universities. That's his plan and his strategy to try and make himself an important leader in China. He goes in 2012, steps down, and then the system seems to go dark. The things like the Thousand Talents Plan, which he had introduced, starts to become less transparent. Then in 2015, Xi Jinping raises the question of Made in China 2025. It's at the National People's Congress in March. Li Keqiang presents it, and it's really a strategy for getting advanced technology, bringing that technology back to China, and then in terms of, if you've got a production process, you're producing a good 100 steps to make it. You want the first 70 steps of that process now manufactured in China, made in China, so that you get a higher value added. That was very important. Xi Jinping also in 2015 said that the the overseas scholars, are a focal point of United Front work. Now, when he says that, I think that's a silly thing to say, because it means if you're the FBI, you should anticipate that there are going to be all these communist agents, Chinese communist agents, running around the United States trying to encourage Chinese scholars in the United States and businessmen to transfer their technology. The United Front has been a strategy to mobilize non-party elements, what the Chinese would call. And so these people become a target of Chinese efforts. And really in 2015, the FBI, for the first time, raises the question of the Thousand Talons plan and starts warning people about it. So on that side, you've got China being much more assertive and much less 没有透明度. There's not much transparency in trying to do this. Then in comes Donald Trump. And the Trump administration, as of, for me, spring of 2018, is really a time when the whole thing ratchets up. You get the trade war. You get the Section 301 from the U.S. Trade Representative Office that talks about China's unreasonable business practices. You get the Department of Defense saying that China is a strategic competitor that has the goal of global preeminence, not just pushing the U.S. out of Asia, but global preeminence. The FBI gives the National Institute of Health the name of 3,000 Chinese scholars in the United States who they want to see investigated. And it's at that time that the intelligence agency says that there are about 2,600 members, people who have joined the Thousand Talons plan in the United States. And I guess the last one I would mention is Director Wray goes in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee in March and said that China is fighting a war, what he called a all of society effort. It's the only time he says it, denies that, later on at the University of Michigan, he says, well, I only said it once, but it was enough to make everybody worry, and that they were using non-traditional. Another key word in this whole thing is non-traditional agents, professors, grad students, businessmen, not spooks, not spies, but these non-traditional. And that's part of also the China Initiative, which then comes out in November of 2018. And it talks about non-traditional agents of the Communist Party. And it calls on universities and university administrators to investigate and to look for spies, essentially, within their universities. Look for people who are doing this kind of illegal intellectual property rights transfers. Long answer for a short question.
Oh, thank you so much for this really, really rich overview that there are changes both in the Chinese domestic politics and U.S. domestic politics and bilateral relations that created this critical juncture. And since you mentioned United Front work, I'd like to make a short comment or a question, because United Front work, of course, is very broad. And I think here in the U.S., in the discourse, there is often a type of conflation that the Chinese government's overseas influence includes a lot of things that is not just about technological transfer, but also about suppressing dissent. And a lot of the quote unquote United Front work that targets overseas Chinese communities, including the academic community, are with regards to surveillance, that is suppression of academic freedom, but do not necessarily concern technological transfers in the technical sense. And I was curious, in your work, in conversations with policy people, is there a misunderstanding of conflating these issues, or is it a purposeful conflation in terms of Chinese people playing into this kind of stereotype of like non-traditional collectors and espionage and surveillance?
Well, I think the United Front strategy changes.
Mm.
That's really what happens. We can see this in France. I was reading a document in France, CICET, in Washington, a research institute. They document how the United Front workers, the agents, were basically going around to organizations, business organizations, the kind of organizations that were highlighted in the 2001 document, and calling on them to help China develop and playing on sympathy, playing on love of country, trying to get people to make these kinds of contributions to China, which is different than the political stuff. The political stuff is still there. The United States, in some ways, Yangyang, is somewhat unique in this. I mean, Canada's engaged in this kind of battle, and the battle is all about political interference. Australia has the same kind of thing, political interference, right? So that's another way that the United Front is seen to be, the United Front Work Department is seen to be engaged. But in the United States, where there's the world's best technology, that's where this focal point really turns on the issue of technology.
Thank you so much for this distinction. So we see there are a lot of different issues with regards to technological transfer, with regards to academic freedom, with regards to civil liberties, and it plays out in different cases in different parts of the world or in specific instances as well. But here in the United States, a lot of these conversations focus on one term, national security, that the Chinese government's aggressive overseas talent recruitment or just scientific advancement in China in general is a national security concern for the United States. Can you unpack some of that? In particular, when a lot of the technologies you describe in the book, as you also raised, are like medical technologies, like cancer research. They are not traditional military technologies that a common person would link with national security. So what does national security mean here? And where does economic primacy play into the understanding or the construct of national security here in the US?
Well, in the US, even back in the days of Bill Clinton was the first president to equate economic security with national security. And again, going back to this whole sense of national power, right? GDP and GDP per capita are important measures of a state's power. And so that's partly where the economics and the national security come together. There's the concept of dual use technologies, right? Many of the technologies that are being transferred back, I think the United States intelligence agencies or military would see these as technologies that can be utilized to enhance China's military power. So the United States sees this kind of tech transfer as enhancing China's military power and therefore threatening to the United States. I mean, both states have heightened up this whole sense of tech transfer, collaboration. They've both really put it in a new bottle, and that bottle is national security. And that's really part of what I'm writing as well, which is to say, hey guys, you want to close down what's real national security, but you don't want to close down cancer research. You don't want to close down all kinds of useful exchanges that are really important for humankind.
Absolutely. And so speaking of cancer research, I'll come back to one point that we tabled momentarily earlier with regards to, as you also detail in the book, the National Institute of Health, among all federal funding agencies, was probably the most aggressive, even more than the Department of Energy or the Department of Defense, in pursuing and placing scrutiny and including punitive measures on these kinds of academic collaborations with China and with regards to some instances of non-disclosure or various instances of real or perceived academic misconduct. And so I think one thing that is also really interesting is in the public discourse that China initiative per se is receiving probably the most attention, even though that is a Department of Justice initiative that is very specific with regards to criminal investigations and prosecutions. But federal funding agencies have also launched their own investigations or pressured university administrators to do so. And that do not lead to technically prosecutions or jail time, but can also derail careers and lives. And so can you give a brief overview of what are these different layers of different types of scrutiny and their consequences. And one particular question is, why do federal funding agencies have so much power over universities?
Well, let me answer the first one first, and then get to the second one. Well, there are six major agencies that fund most of the scientific research in the United States: Department of Defense. Let's see if I got it. Department of Defense, Department of Energy, Department of Agriculture, NIH, NS Natural Science Foundation, and NASA. Those six, and among those six, NSF I think gives the most money, and second is NIH. Now, NSF also investigates people, but NSF didn't turn on the universities or turn on the Chinese faculty, ethnic Chinese faculty, in the same way that the NIH did. And the NIH really went around threatening universities. The person responsible for this program went around threatening universities and saying to them that if they don't, so I'm starting to answer your second question, if they don't fire people, like he went to University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and he said to them, you have a faculty member who's been teaching there for 27 years. He has not been transparent. He's been getting money from China. He probably joined the Thousand Talents Plan, may not have written it down or put it on his grant application to the NIH. We want him out. And if you are sitting there as the president or the head of research and development at the university, in North Carolina, you're looking at $1 billion disappearing, right? That's money for faculty research, and an important amount of money that would go into the university budget. You can't fight that, right? So when you ask me what's the power is the power of the purse. And NIH, much more than any of the others, really used the power of the purse to really squeeze. I call it its own mini China initiative. The big thing with the NIH, these were not public trials. These were silent tribunals, what I call the silent purge. I was an expert witness in one of these cases, and one leading faculty member at NYU was fired after a panel of 3 scientists met and considered his case, and then decided that he had engaged in unethical behavior. What had he done? He had joined the Thousand Talents Plan, but he'd engaged in unethical behavior, and therefore they fired him.
I see. I think since a lot of our listeners may be academics themselves, and I often get this question in terms of like due process or academic freedom in general, is how does that tenured faculty get fired? It's one thing to bar them from applying for federal grants.
Sure.
And another thing is, in terms of the power dynamic, is federal funding agencies always have the power of refusing to fund a research project. And so that is already a power of denial. So then what is this kind of leverage over university administrators? That university administrators would choose to prioritize their perceived relationship with federal funding agencies over protecting their community members, especially with the understanding that different universities, and including different administrators at the same university, may have responded differently to the same type of pressure from NIH or federal funding agencies.
Well, as I tried to explain, and I think I did, take someone like, UNC, that's a lot of money. $1 billion is a lot of money. And so university administrators, often the president, had to stand up and say, no, we are not going to fire this person. The best example of that was MIT with the case of Yangyang. And the president of MIT actually is the only president that I know that actually hires a lawyer for Yangyang, right? Other than that, all of these people are left on their own, right? They lose their salaries. Their research is put on hold. Without their salaries, it's very hard to mount a legal defense. So their lives really is, as you mentioned, really become pretty horrible. So I think that's a really important problem for this whole thing. The universities really felt pressured, particularly by NIH, to make these decisions.
That is really interesting. And I'll also footnote this, that Professor Yang Cheng's case at MIT was a criminal investigation and an indictment, and it was not an NIH investigation.
Sure, the DOJ.
Yes.
So, but the big difference was...
So it's a slightly different situation.
Well, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that if the DOJ went after you, you could read on the website of the
Yes.
DOJ that so and so person had been charged with so and so crimes, right? Which made it much more transparent on this on the on the side of the people who are trying to protect these scientists. The NIH is what I really were silent purges.
Exactly.
And very McCarthyite, and the universities did not protect them and really hung them out to dry very quickly.
In terms of NIH investigations, I should also highlight there was one case where it's a University of Connecticut professor who had her termination reversed thanks to her union's collective bargaining agreement that gave her the power to bring in outside arbitration. And so I think there is another note here in terms of where is the power within the academic community, and labor organizing and collective bargaining could be another leverage in terms of power.
Well,
And
Franklin Tsao's wife ran a GoFundMe program and raised over $1 million. Chen Geng even gave Franklin Tsao $10,000. They were able to overturn the verdict and win the case as well. But that's a lot of money for someone to raise, over $1 million.
Yes, and that was mostly in legal fees because that was also
Correct.
a criminal investigation. Yes.
Now, there are a fair amount of lawyers who've been doing this stuff for these people who are not charging fees or are charging minimal fees. If they see this very much as an issue of human rights.
Absolutely. And it's like the legal community, the civil rights community, and also the Chinese American community in general have really been mobilized, and it has become a moment of political awakening for many. And of course, we could talk for hours, but with the remaining time, I would like to kind of like look ahead in terms of what's next, right? We talked a bit about the history in terms of what led to the current moment of crisis, the different power players, and what are the leverage and the ways to push back. And I know that 2 weeks ago, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine have released this new study report with regards to global talent programs and talent recruitment and retention with regards to the U.S. And so I was curious because that study came up with a very specific recommendation in terms of the United States government should coordinate talent recruitment and retention programs, and rather than just relying on the reputation and the prestige of its educational institutions as it had done since like post-World War II. And I was curious, what are your thoughts on these recommendations?
Well, I think that overall it's important if the United States, as you said, the United States can't rely anymore on its prestige, on people wanting to come. People still want to come. There's no doubt. For the toxic environment is really much more for Chinese and Asians. I don't think there's a toxic environment for Indians. So there's also that ethnic question. I think that's very important. There's also the question of H-1 visas and the technological aspects that are raised in that report. I think it takes, there was a policy that said you could only take a certain amount of people depending upon the population of the country, which meant basically that Indians had a really hard time getting H-1 visas because the country is so big. So they've decided to get rid of that ruling. China's doing this, right? Which is why I call it the war. And China's doing this, and they see it as a war. And in 2009, my friend Wang Huiyao wrote a book called The Talent War, right? And so it's very clear that China does this. And if the United States doesn't, to a certain extent, coordinate its own programs, it'll lose out. I mean, the China Initiative is helping it lose out by driving ethnic Chinese out of the United States. And the data show very clearly that people are leaving. Some very, very talented people are leaving. And part of the reason that they're leaving is because of the toxic environment here in the United States.
On this note, if I may ask a final question, since the title of your book is War, as you just mentioned, and in terms of whether one country or the other could lose out, and we've used a very national, we foregrounded the nation or the nation state in our conversation as U.S. versus China. And so I'm curious in terms of what does winning look like in this case, right? What does it mean for a country to win a talent war? Like, is it a good thing? for one country to monopolize or hold a certain position where there is such a concentration of highly educated individuals in one country. As we've talked a lot about different issues with regards like cancer research, it is also important to have diversity, including geographical diversity in scientific
Absolutely.
development. So yeah, so what does winning look like? What does it mean to win?
It depends whose perspective you're looking at.
Okay,
But,
so the
we've been
U.S.
talking.
government's perspective or the
Right.
academia's
From
perspective.
the from the U.S.
Mhm.
government's perspective, winning means training more people, getting the best talent, attracting the best talent from overseas, limiting the outflow of talent, creating the strongest scientific sector that you can. That can again enhance your national power, and if you can stop the other guy, and in this case China, stop your opponent from getting their best talent and certainly drawing talent back from you. I think that's the way the United States would see winning. The other thing is, which I think is really important, is basically, we haven't talked about this, the China initiative worked from the US government perspective because Chinese in the United States are no longer collaborating with Chinese in China, right? And if the goal of this and winning was to stop that tech transfer, the United States has won, to a certain extent. I mean, it loses in terms of the lost talent. It loses in terms of the, lack of publications and lack of research. But I think that the U.S. government, and particularly the Trump administration, was willing to lose those people at the benefit of stopping the continuation of the technology transfer.
And if I may, I think there is also a more profound layer of loss in terms of losing a certain perspective, a certain collective imagination of scientific development that is not just a tool of national power, but a resource for collective enrichment, and that is not confined to any single country or
Sure.
geopolitical borders.
Well, that's
And
why I focus on the question of cancer. That's really important. And yes, basic research. Basic research is trying to understand how the world works. And that's something that people in different countries can work together on to try and understand better and improve the world.
absolutely. One thing that I actually really appreciate from your book is also when you spoke with overseas Chinese scientists who went back to China, either full-time or part-time, to contribute. And a lot of them, you mentioned that there is a sense of cultural affinity or an emotional attachment. And one thing that I might like to add is that beyond that, it may also be a perspective that is thinking that it is a contribution to make scientific development more equal and just with regards to geographical distributions and towards a more egalitarian world of scientific development
You
and
say that as a
working.
scientist, but I can tell you as the Defense Department of the United States is not very interested, and neither is China. I mean, will China really, does it want equality? I mean, a big question going forward in terms of what China's goal is. What is the China dream? Is it equality, or is it that they want it, that China wants to be the most talented, the top talent? In any case, that I agree with you. You're sort of the points you're making in terms of global talent and exchange, but governments rarely see it that way.
Well, on that note, I guess one point is also that maybe people should be seen as more than just brains, but also have a
Sure.
perspective on their bodies, including on the note of medical research and cancer treatments. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, even though I said we could talk for hours, but everyone should go get this book. And you could see that this is still my Chinese training of being a good student that I put all these book stickers in when I read it very closely. And I would like to thank again Professor Zweig for writing this really, really important and timely book and for sharing your thoughts with us. And I would also like to thank the National Committee staff who have helped to make this interview possible, and their work behind the scenes is really crucial.
Well,
And
I'd like to thank you, Yangyang, for doing a terrific job on your side, asking good, challenging questions, keeping it humanistic, right? Which I think is really
well,
important. I'm a political scientist, but I've also tried to look at this from a pretty humanistic level because I've got so many Chinese friends, and I was engaged with the people in the United States, ethnic Chinese in the United States, who have, in some sense, suffered from the China initiative.
Absolutely. And I think it is also really, really important for scientific and technological developments to always keep in mind this human cost and not be blinded by technological arrogance. And so thank you again so much for this kind note
Thank you.
and for sharing your thoughts and insights with us. And so I guess everyone should go get this book. And if you enjoyed our conversation, I hope you will return for future National Committee on U.S. China Relations programs. Thank you so much.
Thanks.